Hey everyone, so for quite some time we have all heard that those of us who support gun rights are being paranoid. We have been told that no one is coming for your guns, and no one is in favor of large sweeping legislation that would turn everyone with a firearm into a criminal overnight. Well then, we have an op-ed by John Paul Stevens, a retired justice, arguing for the repeal of the Second Amendment. And I do not really hear too much pushback from gun control advocates. Now, not that this would ever happen, but hypothetically, if it did, I would not be surprised if the tyrannical elements of our government now, of which there are plenty of them, people being thrown into cages, for example, for victimless crimes, never-ending wars that you are forced to pay for, archaic and absurd rules you must follow, else you'll be thrown into a cage right next to all other non-violent offenders. These are all tyrannical, anti-liberty actions our government engages in, and without the backup of the Second Amendment, without the ever-present basic idea that you have a fundamental right to not have your means of defense taken away from you, without those things, I would not be shocked one bit if those tyrannical elements of our government grew and grew. Also, what just happened across the pond in the UK? That Count Dankula character will be put into prison for a joke. Now, obviously, that is not the United States, but there are far too many people in the US who take pride in advocating punishment for those who commit a hate crime, the definition of which has been growing wider and wider as time goes on, which is frightening to say the least. Frankly, if the day ever comes where the United States government decides to throw people into prison for jokes, as the UK has now done, that is the day you will wish you had a gun. That was a large part of the reasoning behind the Second Amendment if you read the Federalist Papers. And here's another example. What if the US government decides that any woman who had an abortion, no matter when it was during their pregnancy, even if it was just a week in, and any man that supported that decision are on the same level as a murderer? What do you do when women are rounded up by the truckload and shipped to prison because they're found guilty of murder because they took a morning after pill? If the government ever did anything like that, that is when you rely on the Second Amendment. Or how about this? There were a few people associated with the Black Lives Matter movement that killed police officers, and even more that have assaulted police officers, and even more that supported those things being done. Now, obviously, that's a very small percentage of them, but what if the government then paints a broad brushstroke over all BLM protesters as violent members of a mob, rounds them up, and throws them into prison? That is when you rely on your Second Amendment. Now, despite the fact that I think the BLM and SJW movements are foolish, the vast majority of them are peaceful. They do not deserve to be thrown into prison. I will grant you that right now. But what if the government does not feel that way and begins arresting you all for simply having an opinion? That is when you rely on the Second Amendment. What if the government begins throwing people into internment camps because of their race? Do you remember reading about when the US government did exactly that to 120,000 Japanese Americans? Do not think for a minute that our government is not above that. Don't think for a second that our government hasn't grown beyond that, because they haven't. That is when you need the Second Amendment, when they resort back to their old childish ways, which they really haven't grown out of too much. Another similar example. What if all your fears about Trump comes true and he tries to imprison or deport all Muslims or Middle Eastern people, similar to what Executive Order 9066 did to those Japanese people, signed by FDR? That is when you rely on your Second Amendment. The government is not your friend. It cares about you for purely PR reasons. And if a situation ever comes along where they don't need you anymore, they will roll over you and think nothing of it. The natural right to defend oneself is the last line of defense against a government that no longer needs your approval. And here's another incoherent part of the gun control movement. Many social justice warriors are the same people who advocate stricter gun control or an outright ban. In fact, they will oftentimes cite other countries that have banned guns in their argument as to why we need more gun control. So don't try and tell me you don't really want a total ban, because I've seen far too many people advocate banning even semi-automatic weapons, which is basically almost all guns in the US anyway. Pistols are semi-automatic guns. FYI. So as I said, many times they are social justice warriors. Their narrative consistently refers to the tyrannical aspects of the US government, some of which I could agree with, some of which I cannot agree with. But with that being said, how is it that they cannot figure out that this is what the right to own a gun is all about? On one hand, they claim there is a police state that is committing outright murder of innocent people. On the other hand, they want to diminish the ability to possess a gun, which is arguably the biggest reason our government has not completely gone off the deep end. They know full well that total tyranny is impossible with an armed population. Any innocent person being killed by any means is a horrible tragedy. But an out-of-control government with a defenseless population, well, that's not just a tragedy, that is a massacre waiting to happen, and your history books are filled cover to cover with situations exactly as I have described. So forget your slogans, put some actual thought into this. Thank you, and that's all.